and the Asian Development Bank. So my name is Nick Chisholm, and I'm a senior lecturer here in UCC in the Department of Food Business and Development. I'm also program director of the MSc in Food Security Policy and Management, which you'll hear a bit about in this webinar. And I'm the director of the UCC Centre for Global Development. So just a few remarks before we start the webinar. Obviously, we're living in a very uncertain world at the moment. And I think COVID-19 has demonstrated very clearly why international development is important. It's highlighted both global interconnectedness and as well the fragility of our current social and economic systems. And it's shown there's an urgent need to address multiple interrelated development challenges, obviously in relation to health directly and health systems, but also not just in relation to that, but also more broadly in relation to poverty and inequality, environmental degradation, unsustainable food systems, inequalities in relation to gender and race, and many other issues. So I think COVID-19, amongst other things, is demonstrating the importance of international development and taking a global perspective. We're really delighted to be partnering with the Asian Development Bank in this event. The ADB is a major development player, development organization, working at the cutting edge of development issues in the dynamic Asia and Pacific region. We know Asia as a very dynamic region, but the region also has many, many development challenges. For example, 836 million people living in poverty. And you'll hear about those development challenges shortly from our colleagues in the Asian Development Bank. Ireland is a member of the ADB, but it's quite likely that the bank isn't all that well known to our audience today. So this is really a great opportunity to learn about the organization and also about career possibilities with the ADB. And we're delighted that 2 Irish staff members of the ADB are also participating in this event, and we'll give you insights into their career progression. So we'll move straight on to the webinar. So first of all, we're going to have a presentation on the ADB by Samantha Hung, who is the Deputy Representative in the European Union of ADB. After Samantha's presentation, Noel OBrien and Declan McGee, both Irish staff members of the bank, will briefly talk about their career progression into the bank and their within it. Then I'll be briefly discussing the MSc Food Security Policy and Management and the potential placement and career opportunities associated with that MSc program. And then we're going to open it up for questions. We ask you to post your questions in the live chat section, and we'll try to answer all of them. And we also intend to share the presentations with you after the event. So without further ado, it gives me really great pleasure to hand over to Samantha for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Nick. I hope everyone can hear me. It's a real pleasure to be here talking to you today, and we really appreciate this collaboration with UCC. So as mentioned, I think my slides are just coming up now. What I'd like to do for the first part of this webinar is to provide you with a broad overview of the Asian Development Bank and some of the exciting career opportunities that we offer, particularly for entry-level candidates. And then I'll hand over to my colleagues to talk a little bit more about what it's like to work in the bank and their own career paths. So moving on to the first slide, I'd just like to start about telling you a little bit about myself. As Nick mentioned, my current role is the Deputy Representative at ADB's European office, and that's based in Frankfurt. I've been at the Asian Development Bank for almost 11 years now, and this is my 4th kind of job in the bank. I've moved around a lot. And I actually joined ADB as a gender and development specialist in our knowledge department. And that's actually my technical background. But just I think it also always helps to give people a sense of how you got into development. So in my case, I actually didn't really originally plan to. I originally studied law and commerce degrees in Australia. I'm a dual British and Australian national, but I'm obviously also part Asian. You can tell that by the way I look. But upon graduation, I decided that I didn't really want to practice law, or at least not yet. So I decided to volunteer with the Australian government volunteer program and take like a gap year post-graduation. And it was through that program that I got placed in Vietnam, and this was in the mid-90s. with UNICEF, and I got placed in working directly on a gender and development 28 province microfinance type program. And it was during that year that I was tasked with a lot of field work to do 2 pieces of concrete research for UNICEF in Vietnam. And they were on savings mobilization amongst women borrowers and also on basic health communication. And it was really through that experience that I got hooked. I loved it, and I got very stimulated by the whole gender equality issues in developing countries. And it was through that that I went and pursued a master's in international development after. And so I was fortunate that UNICEF actually hired me on, and I did my master's by distance while I was actually employed in the field. And that was really what set me off on an international development career. And since then, I worked as a gender specialist in after UNICEF, also for the New Zealand aid program, the Australian government, regional organizations in the Pacific. And it was at that stage that I joined ADB mid-career, if you like. And since then, I've gone on to do more management type roles because I decided I wanted a change. I'm still very connected with gender, but it's not my day job right now. And I guess the last point there is that a bit about my personal life. I also have a family. I have 3 teenage children that are finishing the secondary stage of education, and I have a house full of pets. And I guess my point there is that when you do international development work, it does make other aspects of your life more complicated in a way, because you're often balancing different careers. But it is possible, and organizations like ADB support you with their HR policies. My main message through this slide really is that going into the international development career has many different types of entry points. It's not necessarily linear. It might be more complicated than more conventional type of job in your home country, but I would not change it for the world in terms of how interesting and rewarding it can be. Okay, so that's me. Moving on now to the actual main topic about ADB. As Nick mentioned, when you talk about the Asia Pacific region, it's important to remember that despite the rapid economic growth and it being a very dynamic region in terms of a lot of its development success, it is still a region which is home to a very large proportion of the world's extreme poor and those that are poor and at risk of going back into poverty due to economic and other shocks. And the current coronavirus pandemic is an example of that kind of shock that's putting a lot of the hard-won development gains in the region at risk. So ADB, if you move on to the next slide, this is our mission, our vision, our current vision under our corporate strategy to 2030, which is called Strategy 2030, is that we will support the region to be more prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. Achieving eradication of extreme poverty still remains very central, particularly for the region's poorest and most vulnerable economies. So moving on, ADB was actually founded in 1966, and at that time, the poverty challenge was much more stark, and that was central to our purpose at the time of creation. It was a very different Asia-Pacific landscape. We were created, well, it's almost 54 years now, and at that time, we had what we call our founding members. We now have 68 members. When I say members, I mean member governments, of which Ireland is one. Basically, they are the governance of the bank in terms of our strategic directions and approval of policy, etc. We have a resident board of directors as well, and Ireland is represented through a constituency office. So of the 68 members, 49 are geographically in the region, and 40 of those are actually active borrowers. The other members are also part of our governance, but they're situated outside the region and they are more donor members. Japan and the US are the 2 largest. And our headquarters are in Manila, Philippines, and you can see there the photo on the top right is the front of the building and our emblem below. So moving on, what makes ADB, I guess, unique and different to other multilateral development banks is that we are uniquely situated in the region and with a mandate which requires us to focus on the region. And in fact, our charter actually specifically prioritizes support for small economies. So that makes us different from other multilateral banks. We also have a very strong historical role in promoting regional and sub-regional cooperation in areas such as the Greater Mekong region or the Central Asian Regional Economic Program, also known as CAREC. We also have a very active treasury operations. So we've actually been active in supporting domestic bond markets since the early 70s. We were the first in 1970 to issue a foreign issuer in Japanese yen. And since then, we have issued many other local currency bonds in many other countries. And we are supporting thematic bonds such as gender bonds, ocean bonds, environmental bonds, etc. So on the next slide, I can show you our geographical coverage. It's actually quite a large geographical landscape when we talk about our membership. Starting from the far right of the screen, several small Pacific Island countries. And the most recent member is a very small island country called Niue, which joined, I think, earlier last year. But it spans across 5 geographical sub-regions, right across to the right, where you're getting quite close to European countries such as Georgia and Armenia. The countries in red are those that are within the region, but they are advanced or they have graduated because of their economic level. So they're members, but they don't actually borrow. We have many, it might be a bit small, but wherever there's an asterisk, that represents where we have a field office in addition to our headquarters. And the list of countries on the right, sort of left-hand side, those states are non-regional members. And there are 19 of those. 17 of those are in Europe. So all but the US and Canada. And those are the ones that the office where I work in Frankfurt primarily liaises with. So on the next slide, it gives you a little bit of overview about Ireland's relationship with ADB. So Ireland joined in 2006. And you can see the capital subscription that has been contributed into our core operations. In terms of membership size, it's not that large. It represents less than 1% of total shareholding, but it has been a very important contributor to our special funds, such as our Asian Development Fund, which is a grant fund for those countries that are poorer, and also our Technical Assistance Fund. It has also contributed to several other trust funds, and probably the most interesting and contemporary one is one that was approved last year. And you can see the photo on the top right where your minister and one of our vice presidents announced it officially at our annual meeting last year in Fiji. And that's a trust fund for climate change and disaster resilience in small island developing states, namely most of our Pacific Island members, as well as the Maldives and Timor-Leste. Ireland has also generously contributed to our trust funds in thematic areas such as gender and governance and aid effectiveness. So by being a member, your governor, you have a governor to the bank, and that's sat with the Department of Finance, and you also have an alternate governor. And as I think I mentioned earlier, you're part of a constituency group with other European countries and Canada on our resident board in the Philippines. So moving on, what do we do in terms of our core business? I think this is probably no surprise to most of you in the audience that primarily our core business, we are a development bank, so we provide finance. We provide that through loans and grants for the poorer countries. And that's in the public sector to government, but it's also to the private sector. So we have 2 arms of our operations. On the private sector side, we also offer guarantees and equity investments to de-risk private sector investing in developing member countries. Arguably also more important and where we add value is not just our finance, but the knowledge that we bring with that. And in terms of the practical solutions that we can offer based on our experience, facilitating learning from other countries and helping to replicate good practice. And it's this technical assistance that comes with the projects that actually ensures the effectiveness and the sustainability. And we also, through our engagement, promote policy dialogue with governments and other stakeholders in our developing member countries. So moving on, in terms of our corporate strategy, the Strategy 2030 that I mentioned earlier, this strategy highlights 7 thematic operational priorities for the region. And these were derived really through an extensive consultation process with our member governments and development partners in what they considered were the most important thematic issues that ADB could help add value and support in. On the top hand of the slide, the white part, those are the 7 operational priorities. I won't go into each one in detail in the interest of time, but just to highlight a few things. So you can see that the first one is addressing the remaining poverty and inequalities, and that's across countries as well as within countries and different groups. In the corporate strategy, we highlight a lot of emphasis on gender equality and climate and disaster resilience. And in fact, up front in the policy, we committed very ambitious targets that 75% of all of what we do on the public sector side and on the private sector side would directly support advancing gender equality and also the climate space. And that's really a reflection of the fact that gender inequalities are still really hindering development in the region in a whole range of sectors and aspects of life. And also the fact that of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world to climate-induced disasters, 6 or 7 of them are in our geographical landscape. So it's extremely important for us to put these 2 issues as central to what we do. Some of the other issues that, as we're seeing greater urbanization, there's a lot more emphasis on supporting urban development in a holistic way and how to make cities more livable. So this also means working more holistically across sectors. So some of our urban projects tackle issues such as urban transport systems, water and sanitation, economic development, etc., etc. But on the other side of the coin, we still invest quite a lot in ensuring rural development to, mitigate against that urban pull, but also to ensure food security and agricultural production is sustainable, including in light of climate change. And governance is key across the board, and as is supporting regional cooperation and integration. On the bottom half, you can see some of our key approaches. I mentioned knowledge services already, but on the financial side, it's also important that ADB recognizes we're not the only player, and we can't meet the needs on our own of the developing challenges in the region. So our role in that respect is very much to be a mobilizer of additional financing and catalyzing that through other financiers, but also by helping to support private sector operations so that we can support a more vibrant private sector market in our developing member economies. And you can see there that we also have a target around the proportion of private sector operations relative to the whole pie by 2024. If we can move on to the next slide, which also, there we go. So ADB is also, through this strategy, recognizing that the ambitious development agenda of all our member countries also needs to be tailored to different local circumstances, and that we need to strengthen our country-focused approach to reflect the different stages of development that the particular country may be in. So we group them here into 4 types of countries, recognizing context. So on the one hand, we have an increasing number of upper middle income countries, such as China, India, etc., where the solutions may be different compared to those that are on the lower income and middle income scale. We also have a group of small island developing states and fragile and conflict affected situations which demand their own kind of unique responses. So we are seeing a greater focus on those as well. Just to mention, when we talk about fragility in ADB, we talk about fragility in terms of smallness, and so a lot of the small island countries fit into that kind of definition, as well as the likes of Afghanistan. We also talk about fragility at a subnational level. So, for example, in the Philippines, where we are headquarters, we also have pockets of conflict in Mindanao in the south of the country. So in terms of scale and our annual budget, what I've got shown on this screen are the high level figures of our annual operations last year, 33.74 billion. So it's pretty sizable, and we are growing our portfolio as a bank. And you can see there how that's split up. So over 21 billion of that is the core financing. It's the loans and grants and private sector investments. But that's combined with about 11 to 12 billion last year of co-financing. And then the small 237 million is the technical assistance. It might seem small, but that's really critical to ensuring the effectiveness, because that's the knowledge and capacity development that we bring with our financing. If you look at the next slide, how it's split across the regions, I mentioned before that we have 5 geographical sub-regions, and we are also structured that way internally in terms of our operations. So the Pacific is the smallest, 0.64 billion, but that's by no means a reflection of the lower importance. It's a very important region as well. It's just that they're much smaller economies with a lower absorptive capacity, so the dollar amount is obviously smaller. Then moving across to the left, we have East Asia, which is Mongolia and China, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central and West, and then also a regional pot that cuts across for the regional activities. Traditionally, over the years, Southeast Asia and South Asia have tended to be the largest regional portfolios in terms of dollar amounts, but they fluctuate a little bit year to year. However, Central and West Asia region is also one where it's growing, and we've seen growth in recent years. If you look at the next slide, this gives you an idea of how that total bucket is split between different sector operations. You can see there that transport and energy are the largest parts of the pie, and they usually are, give or take a little bit. Some years one is higher than the other. And that reflects the fact that ADB is largely, in lots of ways, an infrastructure bank, and governments look to us to finance large infrastructure projects. However, the nature of those two sectors is also evolving. So in the transport sector, for example, in the past, we did a lot of rural roads, as reflecting that was the need at the time. These days, our transport sector portfolio is moving much more into urban transport solutions. So how do we develop, for example, effective bus rapid transit systems in some of the growing larger urban cities? Similar on the energy front, a really strong shift in towards green and carbon neutral energy. And that means that we also need to get more expertise in those areas. That being said, you can see there that we do still work across a real suite of other sectors, some of them being other types of infrastructure, such as water and sanitation and other urban infrastructure. But also we work in social sectors such as health, very important in current times. Education is also growing. And we also have important investments in finance sector development, agriculture, public sector management, etc. And that means that the kinds of people we hire work across all these different areas and bring that different type of expertise as well. I will show you a little video shortly with an example of the projects. So moving on, it would be a real amiss of me not to mention ADB's COVID response under current times. ADB, it's actually at times like this where ADB is really put to the test and rises to the challenge to respond to these kinds of crises. We've done it in the past when there have been economic crises, for example. And now in the current times, that's when governments really look to us for urgent support. So I'm proud to say that we did respond very quickly, even way back in February, largely through health sector support, and also private sector loan right in Wuhan, which was the epicenter at the time. So we had a loan to a pharmaceutical company to help them provide supplies that were in much need at that time. But since then, we've really been scaling up our support. And actually, our president announced in April a additional 20 billion total response package. And since then, people in the bank have been working very closely with governments to get this money out the door as quick as possible. A lot of this has been budget support, so support to the government, to different governments to actually help them manage their response. And that's largely been in the health sector as well as in social protection and stimulating the economy, particularly for micro and small medium enterprises so that they can survive the wave. Longer term, we will be extending that support, medium and longer term, to help our economies build back better so that they can be more resilient in the longer term. What I'm showing here on this slide is a screenshot of our dedicated website on our coronavirus response for anyone who's interested. And on that website, there's a lot of information about what we are doing in terms of concrete projects, but there's a lot of also information about the knowledge work that we're doing. And that includes regularly update economic projections, as well as a policy database on all the different policies that are being introduced in the different member countries. Some of the work we're doing on the private sector to support trade finance and ensure trade flows are maintained or stimulated and restarted as much as possible. So that just gives you a quick overview of our over operations. Before going on to our actual career opportunities, I wanted to show you a short video about an ADB project on the ground from the perspective of a beneficiary. And the reason I want to show you this is because I think one of the most rewarding parts about an international development career is actually seeing the impact on the ground. And some of the highlights definitely of my own career has been the fieldwork experience. So if we could please just switch over to the video and hopefully it will work.
Ako si Bitol, mas paspas ako madayagan kaysa sa mga layaki. Paspas ako mudayag bisan uno na kahoy. Makautok ako nan hilayom. Ako kusgan. Dini ako na lugar nagsulig sa barangay Katipunan. Isa kagamay na barangay sa isla ng Siargao sa Pilipinas. Ini ang ako pamilya. Anak ko tatay mang alimanguhay. Nagtabang ako sa ija kada adlaw. Nagtrabaho kami didto sa kalubihan. Kundili nagtinabangay kami bisan ang ako maestra naghuya sa sunod na bayay.
Peter, human na nimo assignment.
Jadtong nagsulig ako, waya pa'y tulay. Naghuya kami sa gamay na isla. Sa tabang ng ADB, nahimo ang tulay gikan sa amo bayay pasingod sa ako higaya. Isa ka tulay pasingod sa amo eskwelahan. Sa kuman, dili lang kami konektado sa dugo, kundi konektado kami sa mga tulay. Pero naghuya kami apeke sa tubig, may isa na problema. Sa eskwelahan amo nahibaw-an nahitungod sa climate change. Nahibaw-an ko na ang kabakhawan delikado na. Sa ako kaugalingon nagkayaot an ako huna-huna. Isa ako sa kalikasan. Ang kabakhawan pareha sa ako kuya. Ang ugat nagprotekta sa ako pamilya sanan sa komunidad. Nagprotektahan kami sa dagat, nagprotekta sa among palibot para kami buhi. Dini sa barangay malisod dinbawaan an uyan, mas mataas na mga bagyo makusog laong nan mga tiguyang ang palibot ay nagbag-o na. Ug saan amo barangay tagtabangan ng ADB para paghimo ng seawall para protektahan ang kabayadan sa pagtaas ng tubig. Pagkatapos sa seawall, may isa pa ka proyekto tagtagaan ng financial assistance an ako mga ginikanan para ako sanan ako mga igsoon maka-eskwela. Nangutang an akong mga ginikanan nan motor para jaoy paghasod sa eskwela. Ang kwarta taghatag sa amo, tagamit namo para pag-atiman sa among kalawasan. Tungod niini ang among komunidad permi nagkadto sa health station. Sa akong pagsulig, ang akong maestra naglaong na mabudyong ako. Pero namati ako, kini ang akong nahibaw-an. Kung ato pasuligon ang ato komunidad, protektahan, palambuon, sanan, hatagan ang kalusugan ug edukasyon para malig-on ta, para mabuhi. Pero tanawa, unoy ako nahibayuan. Bata pa ako, di ba?
Okay, I hope you can hear me again, and I hope that you could view that video well. As I mentioned, that's a perspective from a beneficiary, but to give you a sense of how that connects to what I was saying earlier about what our projects look like, what that person, Beetle, was talking about from someone living in the community perspective, it's how she sees ADB projects. But what that actually is the result of interventions from ADB across a range of areas. So firstly, it's an infrastructure project support. So she mentioned building of the bridges, the seawalls. It's also a reflection of support for resilience in the climate and disaster space, because she mentioned awareness and the seawall construction is part of the physical response to that, but also awareness of community members and behavior change on how they may need to change their practices. And it's also perhaps less obvious, a social protection project. She mentioned about a family allowance and getting money and using it to go to school and health. That reflects ADB support for quite a large government social protection project, which provides money to poor communities in the hands usually of the women of the household. And part of the condition is that a proportion of that money has to be invested into children's education and basic accessing of basic health services. So that sort of holistic support converges down when you talk about the community level and how it impacts them. So that just gives you a sense of the kind of impact that you could be having if you are working for an organization like ADB. So what I'll do now is move on to talk about our human resource practices and some of the programs we have. So here, as you can see from this slide, we have a total staffing of about 3,500 people globally across the board. And they're divided into what we call international staff. So those are people that are recruited internationally to an expatriate kind of scenario. Then we also have local staff. Some of those that are recruited in our headquarters in Manila, that being the large proportion because we have all our core functions there, as well as local staff in our field offices. So to work for ADB, you have to be a citizen of one of our member countries. So as an Irish national, that would count. And we have not that many Irish staff in total, about under 10. But all of those Irish staff currently fall into the international staff category. So on the next slide, in general, this is what I'm talking about, our general recruitment. I'll move on later to talk about our entry opportunities, which may be more directly relevant. But as across the board, generally, we recruit people that already have a few years of experience. A lot of our recruits come at all stages of the years, of their life. Some in their 20s and their 30s. A large group come more from in the 30 to 40 age group, sort of mid-career type people. But a lot of them stay on for quite a long period afterwards. At least we require a university degree, but in 9.9 times out of 10, we also look for postgraduate qualifications. But we also look for a range of other soft skills. So the ability to communicate well and interact well, multicultural skills, ability to relate to all kinds of people are really important skills to be able to function well in an organization like ADB. We also look for people with international experience and exposure, and the ability to grow into leadership and management type roles. Our HR colleagues used to make this analogy to a banyan tree, being a tropical tree with very strong roots and deep roots. So that's people with that come with a technical specialization. But banyan trees also spread and grow very wide with many different branches. So we want people that are able also to learn and grow within the organization. On the next slide, this is really just to show the different types of expertise we recruit from. And that's really a mirror of the breadth and depth of the types of areas we work in. So a lot of people think, you're a bank, we only hire really economists or people with a strict development degree. We do hire a lot of those people, but because of the nature of our operations, we also hire people that might be engineers, financial experts, people that come from merchant banks, people that are working in evaluation, procurement specialists, portfolio management. But we also hire people that are in support functions. So HR specialists, for example, or people that manage our budget, our internal budget, people that manage our facilities, logistics, all that kind of thing. So there are very few professions, if you like, where there would be zero opportunity for you at ADB. Of course, there are some that we hire much more from. And I think the audience here today would be a typical kind of pool of candidates which may have jobs that are matching their profile in the future. So probably getting onto something which may be more directly of interest to you is on the next slide. I'd just like to give you an overview of our internship program. So this is a project-oriented type learning opportunity designed specifically for graduate students to gain experience while they are studying, based on ADB's needs and their own needs. So it's offered twice a year in 2 batches. And you can see there the different application periods that we have there. And we have one that's actually coming up very soon. You have to be currently enrolled in a master's or postgraduate program before and after doing the internship. So probably what would be most relevant to those of you listening is the summer batch. And basically that would be where you apply earlier in the year and you actually do the internship in the summer, or for the other batch, you apply in the summer and you do it in the sort of winter holidays. That could be in any of our regional departments. It could be in our private sector operations department, but it's actually advertised as a discrete terms of reference and job. So it's advertised publicly on our website, on our careers page. And if you were interested in applying, you would have a look at the different internship jobs that are advertised, and you would actually be able to see which department it would be in, probably which division, what you're likely to be worked on, and the kind of deliverable that you would be expected to produce and present at the end. And therefore, you would be able to match with your interest and also your own profile. You can apply to more than one, but I'd really recommend tailored applications that most best fit your own profile and area of study. So after the internship program, the next closest to sort of entry level type program we have is what we call our Young Professionals Program, or YPP. It's not a graduate program per se, in that we expect people to have at least 2 years experience in addition to their postgraduate study. But it's you come in as an international staff member, and it is the equivalent of our entry-level recruitment program. You come in on a 3-year contract, and you join a host department where you are assigned to for the first 12 months. And then after that, you get to rotate to other departments. So typically, young professionals would work on projects for the first year, for example, and then after that, they might get rotated into our strategy and policy department or some other economics department, and then go back to their host department. Usually at the end of the 3 years, assuming both sides are happy, you can stay on and regularize your job. A lot of the people that are very senior in ADB now were young professionals way back. But also it's just a really amazing opportunity to get your foot in and have a really fulfilling sort of work experience. You can apply up to the age of when you're 32. So you can't be more than 33 when you join. So there is that space from finishing your postgraduate degree and getting 2 years, and then up to several years after that. So it's, there's a quite a broad window. And that does mean that we get people with many different profiles applying and also different level of experiences. The program is advertised once a year, and it's usually in the third quarter. So this year, we don't have exact dates yet when it will be advertised, but there will be a program, and that would mean that the actual intake would be for next year. It's a several-month application process. So I'd encourage those of you that are interested to watch the space, and there's a lot of information on our website about how these programs operate, frequently asked questions, etc. And like the internship program, the young professionals program, they are advertised as specific positions. So you're not applying in a generic way. You actually would be applying to a young professional job in an X department, in an X area. So you should be tailoring your application. And that means that they vary, the pool varies every year, depending on which departments would like to recruit a young professional that year. So, for example, in recent years, we've had our private sector operations, because they are growing, asking for more young professionals. So when you join ADB, the next slide is about what we offer. As I mentioned, young professional is an international staff member. So these kinds of benefits would apply to you as a young professional if you were successful. ADB is a generous employer, so we market our salary based on annual salary surveys and reviews every few years, and we benchmark against other similar organizations. Because you will be coming in an international kind of recruitment, we also offer a range of other benefits that reflect the fact that you're living away from your home country. So those includes things such as housing assistance, travel, relocation, home country travel, so an entitlement to go back to your home country once a year, to stay reconnected, international health insurance. And for those people that have dependents or partners, we also provide dependency allowances and support for education assistance, helping partners to look for work, etc. So it's a pretty generous employer. So that brings me to the end of my formal part of the presentation. We do have a lot of information online at our career site. We're also very active on social media, and we also have LinkedIn presence. So, and you have my email contact at the end there. So please feel free to reach out if you would like to after this event. But I can also take questions at the end. So with that, I'd like to hand over now to my two of my Irish colleagues who can talk about their own experience of how they developed their careers and also how they joined ADB. So I'll hand over first to Noelle. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Can I just check that I can be heard clearly? Yes, okay, thanks, Michael. So my name is Noel OBrien. I grew up in South Tipperary, and I'm joined today by Declan. I'm currently sitting in West Clare, and Declan is sitting in Bangkok. I mean, just to pick up on where Samantha introduced the Ireland membership of ADB, it joined in 2006, and so That was the first time that Irish people could be employed as staff at ADB or as consultants. There are currently 5 of us that I'm aware of at ADB. I'm the one female, and I have 4 male colleagues. We're all fairly recent. We've all been at the bank for less than 5 years. There were a couple of people prior to that, but who've already retired. And then people who also work as consulting. So I grew up in Tipperary, went to school in the Mercy Convent in Care, and I did a science degree in Trinity in the 80s and graduated at a time when Ireland was really very different than it is today. I met a friend the other night and said, you know, when you graduated in 88 or 89, there were just no jobs. What did one do? So very different circumstances today. But I did a little bit of work in teaching, and then I did a master's in applied environmental sciences. And then I went overseas on a placement with APSO. APSO was part of the Irish government's overseas development program, part of the Department of Foreign Affairs. I guess it started in the early 70s or so, but then closed up in the early 2004. I think right now people go overseas in a similar program with VSO Ireland. So I went to Cambodia with APSO. There was a really interesting program at the university, the Royal University of Phnom Penh. It was run by an amazing Mary Noel's sister from the US, Dr. Sister Louise Ahrens. And I ended up setting up an environmental program at the university. And that environmental program has gone on to be a fully fledged environmental science department, and with graduates working all over the country in Cambodia. And many of the graduates, the original graduates, were in senior positions or in senior positions in government, in NGOs and international organizations. So like Samantha said, she was hooked in Vietnam. I was hooked with Cambodia. And I spent quite a bit of time after that working in Cambodia, but then also regionally with what I always describe as the South-based institutions. There's a community forestry center in Bangkok, which promoted for community engagement in forestry throughout Asia, from Mongolia, the Pacific, and right through to Iran and Afghanistan. So I worked with those for a number of years and spent a couple of years with the Mekong River Commission. And then I moved and started to work in the climate change space. And so for the last 10 years, that's where I've been. I spent just over 7 years with UK aid-supported climate change investment in Kenya, working through a commercial company, team leading one of the UK aid programs there. We worked on a whole span of climate change efforts, from legislation, policy, private sector, public sector engagement, and across sectors from energy to climate smart agriculture, etc. Happy to answer more questions on that space. 2 years ago, I joined ADB as part of their scaling up of climate change staff. I work in the Pacific Department, where I am the principal climate change specialist. And Samantha had talked about Strategy 2030, where we have the operational priority 3, which focuses on low carbon development, the environmental sustainability, but a really big effort to increase adaptation and resilience investments. So just in terms of what we did, so my focus is the Pacific. We have 12 small island developing states. 6 of them are fragile and conflict affected states. So, and then we have all of the top vulnerable countries in the world, We have 3 atolls. So we collaborate with the Maldives as the 4th atoll nation. So what does climate change look like on the ground from ADB's perspective? So at the very, a key step is obviously making sure that our business as usual investments in the transport, energy, urban, water, sanitation sectors, that they are climate proofed. So we work to ensure those investments are secure in relation to particularly sea level rise is one of our biggest challenges in the Pacific. Also the tropical cyclones, extreme rainfall, and then also these really recurring droughts, which are becoming more prevalent and linked in with the El Nino, La Nina and other cycles in the Pacific. Second area, we're obviously trying to build back better. So we've just had Tropical Cyclone Harold in the Pacific. We've had Tropical Cyclone Gita in 2018. So particularly like with our energy sectors, how do we make sure that that's built back better? We raise climate finance for the countries. So in addition to ADB's generous contribution to adaptation, we work with the Green Climate Fund. We work with the GEF and other bilateral development partners to co-finance investments. So an example of that might be Kiribati, where we're just kicking off a project which will establish desalination plants, but which will be powered by renewable energy. We also do a lot of work now in disaster risk reduction. We have a financial instrument called disaster contingent financing, which is established to be a very quick release in funding post extreme events. We had that in place for 8 of the Pacific countries, so that when COVID came, the pandemic was declared in February to early March. We had a policy adjustment to bring health emergencies and pandemics in as part of the disaster policy. And so that financing was able to be released in what was 24 to 48 hour period. So the countries can use that as part of their response mechanisms. So far, most of our countries have avoided importing the virus, but obviously that has resulted in huge economic implications for these small island countries. I think the other area which we are growing our focus on, and which will be part of our scaling up with our new strategy for the Pacific, is the whole area of long-term planning for climate change, and how do we move the climate change analysis and the planning upstream so that our investment decisions are informed by climate resilient decision making. So one of the first major pieces of analysis that we're doing for that is on the island of Tongatapu, which is Tonga's capital city. A large part of it is very low-lying and very exposed to storm surges. So we're trying to work with the government of Tonga to start to take decisions on how you can evolve the city in a more resilient direction, rather than evolving it into areas which are low-lying and you will have a consistent demand. So it's all really interesting. There's never a dull day. And I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have, but I'm going to hand over to Declan right now.
Thanks, Noelle. And it was great to hear some more detail and some of that history. I think I've heard it a few times in different parts, but never fully like that. So that was really, really good to hear. So my name is Declan McGee, and I am the senior country economist and the deputy country director for ADB, based in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. I grew up in Dublin, went to secondary school in Limerick, and then I went to Trinity as well to do my undergraduate. And I suppose I studied economics at the time, and I was thinking, I suppose I always took the development options when I was studying economics, but I was studying sort of pure economics. I think the same thing then happened with when I went and did my master's. I did pure economics, but I took the development options. I think the interest for me was, I suppose I was always interested in traveling, and I was always interested, I suppose, in international relations and politics. And I suppose if you spend a few minutes studying economics, or at least for me, the most interesting question I found is, why are some countries richer and some countries poorer? And I suppose that's a fundamental question that you get into very early on. And so that question was the one that by far and away interested me the most. And I suppose in a sense that sort of led my interest into development. In terms of when I actually started, so after I did work in Ireland for a little bit as an economist on airport regulation. Too long ago to answer any questions on that, but what I did after my master's is, some of you might be familiar with the Overseas Development Institute, the ODI. It's a think tank in the UK. They produce a lot of good work across a range of things in development. They have a fellowship scheme, and the idea behind that fellowship scheme is it's designed for economists who don't have that much experience to go overseas and work in developing country government for a couple of years. So I applied to that scheme fresh out of my master's, and I was sent to Burundi in East Africa for 2 years. So that was really my start there. And that was fascinating. I was very lucky in terms of my timing of my arrival. Burundi had just signed a peace agreement, the Arusha peace agreement, and the country was really positive. They had democratic elections, and everything was very, very positive. Unfortunately, by the time I left 2 years after that, things were looking a little bit less positive and dicey, and unfortunately, they've been on that trajectory ever since. But it was a brilliant experience, and I think what I learned from that is I suppose I was able to get involved in such a wide range of issues across the piece, from being involved in Burundi joining the East African community, the trade area, but also being involved in their early efforts to try and privatize some of their state-owned enterprises and things like that. So I really was in a position to get involved across a lot of things. And when I was there, I got to know a lot of the people who were working in the UK Department for International Development, the UK Aid office. While I was there, of course, that's an organization that's very much in the news today if you're following the news. And when I was there, I was encouraged by a lot of them to try and apply and go and work for DFID. So I then applied through the UK Civil Service scheme. They've got an entrance scheme for economists. So I applied through that and did a little bit of lobbying behind the scenes to make sure I got, or to at least try and increase my chances of getting put in DFID rather than somewhere else that I might have been less interested in. And fortunately, I was lucky. And so I then spent 10 years with DFID. So and that was great. That was a great experience, a fantastic organization, very, very international for a bilateral aid agency or aid ministry as it was. But I got to get involved a lot in the links between growth and poverty. I was involved a lot in the response to the financial and economic crisis, trying to understand the impacts that had, but also the best way of responding. I worked a lot as well on multilateral policy. So the UK's engagement in ADB, World Bank, IMF, so on. And then in 2011, I moved to Myanmar, or Burma as it was at the time, and and I spent 6 years there. So the timing was fantastic. So it was obviously a very, very interesting time. Aung San Suu Kyi had just been released from house arrest. It was a very interesting time from a political economy perspective. Lots of opportunities, lots of things happening. Obviously, huge amount of challenges, and that's very, very clear today. You can obviously see a lot of the very difficult things that have come to the surface, and some of the extremely difficult scenarios that has evolved in Myanmar in recent years. But I learned a huge amount from that. I learned a huge amount not only just about the work I did. I headed up DFID's Inclusive Economic Growth Team, and actually a little note here, myself and Noelle almost crossed, because before she moved to ADB, one of her options was to go to Myanmar as a team leader for a project I had been leading there, but we didn't quite cross at that time. We were to cross later on. But the other thing I learned a lot about that is the complications of the engagements of the international community, and how that plays out in a development context. And for a while, Myanmar was very much the focus center for, I think, a lot of international attention. And it really felt, in the sense that you got an opportunity and some exposure to see how the sausages get made, I suppose, in practice. And unfortunately, when you're close up, it's not always pretty, as the analogy suggests, but like fascinating in terms of understanding the political economy of reform. And obviously, I think probably a lot of you will be aware of some of the challenges that have arisen subsequently in Myanmar. So after working there for 6 years, and 2 children later. So my wife Roisin had also been in Burundi with me initially, and then was not my wife then, but we got married before going to Myanmar. We then were looking for a new challenge while the children were still small, and an opportunity came up to go to Mongolia with ADB. I'd worked a lot with ADB when I was in Myanmar, and I was impressed a lot with the people they had on the ground. I was impressed with the approach that ADB takes. Their approach is a lot more focused on political economy, on understanding the dynamics on the ground. And although technically very, very focused on good practice, they don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, which sometimes you can see creeping in with some international engagements, which means that you can be practical and move ahead. So I applied for the job directly into the Mongolia office, and I was lucky enough to get it, and I've been working in Mongolia for about 3.5 years. I think I'm the only Irish of the 5 Irish staff we have that's working overseas away from Manila. But I get inducted into Manila with Noelle and everyone else every time I pop down for a visit. But the work I've been able to get involved in Mongolia has been really interesting and really wide-ranging. So I oversee strategy and programming. So essentially that means my job is to try and think about what are ADB's strategic objectives in Mongolia, and making sure that the program and the lending operations follow that and are part of some overall strategy of what we're trying to achieve in the country and what we're trying to change and reform. And it's not just a random hodgepodge, but that also gives me a chance to get involved in a lot of different things. So I've been, you can get involved in whatever operations you want. So I've been able to get involved in things I never got involved in before, like air pollution, renewable energy, natural resource revenue management. So like a lot of very, very different things. I also lead the COVID response by ADB in Mongolia, which is very, very interesting. And again, a real underline of why ADB is impressive. It really has moved far quicker than anyone else. Certainly my experience in Mongolia, far quicker and more decisively than anyone else. I oversee all our economics work. So we do forecasts of GDP, current account balance, inflation. I oversee that. My favorite part of my job, no sarcasm at all, is donor coordination. So I have to oversee donor coordination, which for those of you as you look forward, that'll be something you'll really enjoy. No sarcasm at all. And then I also oversee our knowledge work, so trying to sort of develop knowledge products and things like that. So an example there is we're about to produce a paper on increasing female labor force participation in Mongolia. And so what we did is we constructed a model that basically looks at what would happen in Mongolia if you equalized female labor force participation to the rates of male labor force participation. And so what we've discovered with that is if you did that, GDP would increase by 63% over a 30-year period. So like what we're trying to do there is use the knowledge product to make a point about an interesting issue and try and sort of bring relevance to a policy issue that we care a lot about. But all in all, it's been, there's the great thing about ADB is there's so much you can get involved in. And even though I'm a macroeconomist, I've been able to get involved, as I said, in a lot of very, very different areas. I think just to say, I think a couple of questions have come through, and I think one was asking about sort of joining when you're over 35. I think I am certainly speaking for myself, but I think pretty much all of the Irish who joined were over 35 when they joined. So I don't think there's any sense there. I think what ADB is looking for is passionate and experienced people. I think even if you don't have direct development experience already, I think the point is if you can sell the skills that you already have and that you've built up, and use them as a way of pitching yourself. So, all the countries we work with all the time, they have a real wide range of challenges they're facing. And so the chances are some of the work that you've done will be relevant to that. So if you don't have development experience, but you've got really solid experience in another space, that is something that is definitely useful and would be looked at, I think. The last thing I'd say is just sort of more general advice on thinking about a career. And maybe something I wish maybe I'd done a little bit more of. But what I would say is be brave, put yourself out there, get in touch with people, find people on LinkedIn who've got similar jobs to yourself, get in touch with them, reach out, have a conversation. The worst that people can say is no or not reply to you. I kind of wish I had done a little bit more of that when I was out looking first. But I suppose I was lucky in terms of how I got in. But I would really, really encourage people just to reach out, put yourself out there and have a chat with people who've got jobs that are similar to yours, because most of the time people are decent and will say yes. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'm sure there's questions that people want to ask some of the other people that have spoken as well. So thank you for listening, and yeah, thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Declan. And thanks to Noelle and thanks to Samantha. It's all really exciting, and I hope people listening in are kind of excited by all the career opportunities. And I think that's one of the things about international development, that it's so varied and so challenging, but also so incredibly interesting. And as Declan mentioned, ODI, the Overseas Development Institute based in London. I also worked there a bit in my early career, and it's a really good organization. Actually, I was offered one of those fellowships and to go to St. Lucia, and what they told me was that, well, 50% of the population in St. Lucia grow bananas, and you deal with the other people, basically. And I turned it down and went to Bangladesh instead. So whether that was a good choice or not, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, here I am. So we're gonna. I'm going to just very briefly talk about the MSc Food Security Policy and Management. As I think has been made fairly clear. It is generally important if you work in international development to have a relevant master's program and a relevant master's qualification, I might say. So food security is one of those key areas of activity of development organizations, including the ADBs. So I'm just going to fairly briefly talk about the master's program as one of the kind of opportunities for people listening in on this webinar. So next slide, please. Yeah, so before I say a bit about the master's program specifically, I just wanted to kind of emphasize, and this is more wearing my Centre for Global Development hat, that UCC is doing a lot on sustainability and on sustainable development goals. And I suppose this was brought out this year by a new impact ranking system that the Times Higher Education have developed, which is basically ranking universities according to what they do in relation to the SDGs. So UCC came out 32nd globally out of 766 participating universities, which is pretty good. That's in the top 5%. And you can see some of the rankings there on particular SDGs and particularly the rankings in Europe. Now, obviously, not all universities have participated in this ranking system. It's quite new. But, we're doing pretty well. SDG 2, which is the Zero Hunger SDG, of course, we were ranked first amongst European universities in that ranking system in 2020. And we're also doing pretty well amongst a range of other SDGs. So I think across the university, there's a lot of engagement in sustainable development issues, whether it's food security, poverty, water, renewable energy, health, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's just to say that institutionally, UCC is doing a lot in this area. Next slide, please. Speaking specifically then about food security and nutrition. So this is a big challenge globally. There are more than 820 million people globally in chronic hunger. And out of that, actually, by far the biggest number in the Asia and Pacific region, something like 514 million people in chronic food insecurity in the Asia region. So even though, again, we talked about the dynamism, but there's still major problems of food insecurity in much of the region, particularly, I suppose, South Asia, but not only in South Asia. High rates of malnutrition globally. And I suppose actually pre-COVID-19, chronic hunger was actually on the increase. For the last 3 or 4 years, it's actually been increasing rather than going down. A lot of that to do with conflict and climate change and other factors. Food systems are already quite fragile, and obviously COVID-19 has really challenged the food systems and sort of exposed the extent to which, well, I suppose exposed to some extent the globalized nature of our food systems and kind of raise questions about, are these food systems sustainable or not? It's actually estimated, or early estimates by the World Food Programme early on in the pandemic said that more than 250 million people could suffer acute hunger on top of those who are already experiencing it as a result of COVID-19. No action was taken. And other impacts of COVID-19, because of lockdowns, there have been economic effects, there's been educational effects. Obviously closure of schools has resulted in almost 370 million children missing out on school meals, for example. And Samantha mentioned the COVID response of ADB, including social protection measures. And I would imagine some of that is probably around school feeding programs and so on. The next slide, please. So talking very, very briefly about the master's program itself, you can see the link there on the UCC website. I would encourage those of you who are interested in this program to have a look at the details of the program on the website. Basically, this master's program, MSc Food Security Policy Management, is around learning how to address global issues of tackling food security and malnutrition and how to develop a more sustainable food system. Some of you might be familiar with the Eat Lancet Commission report last year on food, planet and health. We had the Irish launch of that in UCC last year. And that issue of really how to develop a global, a sustainable food system, which is sustainable both in terms of obviously meeting food demand, but also staying within planetary boundaries and also providing healthy diets. Those are if you like, those are some of the issues that are addressed in our master's program. It has 4 broad areas of focus, as you can see there. Really understanding food security policy, understanding the planning and implementation of programs that address food security and malnutrition, how to move in the direction of more sustainable food systems, and then a focus on nutrition and dietary quality. So we collaborate with the School of Public Health in UCC in the delivery of this program. So it's kind of a quite multidisciplinary and holistic approach to looking at food security and nutrition. And then a key element of the master's program, which is relevant to the discussion today, I think, is the Applied Research Project, which is a project which the students engage in after the taught component of the program, generally between March or April and August or September. And this is an opportunity to work on real life food security and nutrition issues with development organizations, including Irish NGOs and other organizations, including the International Food Policy Research Institute, with whom we collaborate in delivering the program. But obviously, from what you've heard from Samantha this morning, you know, we can certainly see whether the internship program that ADB is offering is something that can sort of fit within the master's program, whether the master's program can fit within the internship program. There may be possibilities there. So next slide, please. Looking very briefly at career options from the master's program. I mean, you've heard a lot about career opportunities. Food security and malnutrition are huge challenges. They're sort of, you know, one of these sort of big global development challenges that are faced by all regions, both in Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin and Central America when it comes to it as well. Ireland, it was interesting to hear actually that, you know, there are 5 Irish staff in ADB, and obviously very small. I'm sure we all hope that that might increase in future. But overall, Ireland has a very good reputation in international development. You can see our former president there in the top photo, Mayor Robinson, with a community in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. We, I think, punch above our weight as a nation in international development. We're very strong supporters of multilateralism. We, as you know, have just got a seat on the UN Security Council, and I think that'll give us an opportunity to sort of influence there as well. Irish NGOs such as Concern, Trócaire, Goals, Health of Africa are highly respected internationally. So there's, and so is Irish Aid, the government's development cooperation program. So in principle and in practice, there are many opportunities to follow careers in international development, including in the area of food security and malnutrition and sustainable food systems. Irish Aid is one potential employer. These are Irish NGOs. I think there's a kind of misconception sometimes about Irish NGOs that you know, these are kind of like volunteer type jobs. These days, these organizations such as Concern are highly professional organizations. They work very strategically, and you can have a really good career with such organizations as a professional. We've heard from Asian Development Bank as one of the international development organizations that are out there, the UN system, FAO, World Food Programme, IFAD, that's just in the food sector, the UN food agencies, but obviously there are other UN agencies as well that provide opportunities. The development banks, ADB, obviously, African Development Bank, the World Bank, European Commission. So there's lots of organizations there on the international stage where there are opportunities. There are humanitarian organizations, including some of the Irish NGOs. There are research institutes, including the the so-called CGIAR system, the International Agricultural Research Institute, such as the International Food Policy Research Institute, ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Centre, et cetera, et cetera. Potentially, I think there's also jobs in the private sector, particularly with agri-food companies that are starting to get to grips with the need to develop more sustainable food systems. So I would think that there are, potential career opportunities there in the private sector as well. And I think, and there are others, there are consultancy companies and so on. So actually, when you start to look at the career options in international development, there are a lot of them. People are not always familiar with some of the organizations. When you start to scan what's out there, there are actually huge opportunities. And I think, as people have said already, one of the issues is really, what is the route into an international development career? It's not necessarily absolutely straightforward, but there are progression pathways, and some of those have been outlined this morning. Next slide, please. Just briefly and finally then to mention about internship or placement and scholarship options for the master's program. I've mentioned the applied research projects already. That can involve placement with development organizations or research institutes. Again, as I said, I think we can sort of look at whether there's a potential fit, with the internship program that ADB is operating. Currently, we have students on the master's program who are collaborating with the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, with Concern, with Goal, and with World Fish in Bangladesh, one of these CGIAR centers. So I think following the master's program and as part of the master's program, a big part of kind of building your career is getting practical experience, really, and also, as Declan mentioned, networking. Building up contacts. So the applied research project is a mechanism for doing that. Just very, very briefly to mention on funding, the fee rate for the program this year, €7,500 for EU students, 15,000 for non-EU students, quite competitive, certainly by international standards. There are a small number of scholarships for non-EU applicants, although for this coming year they've already been allocated. So far there's no specific scholarships for EU students, but some students may be eligible for SUSI grants. There are other sources within UCC, such as Quercus scholarships. Basically, there's not much of a kind of dedicated nature in terms of scholarships for EU students, but it's certainly worth looking at what's out there. And then when it comes to the applied research project, there may be possibilities of, trying to find some funding that can support people involved in that component of the program. So I think I will stop there. And I know we've run a bit over time, but I think we can open it up for any questions. And I think there were a few questions that came up in the chat, and they could be answered by any of our ADB colleagues.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think there's a specific question around the young professionals and what type of experience people need to have. I think it's good to just come back to Samantha's point earlier that the young professional positions are advertised by specific departments across the bank. There are particular sectors or areas of expertise which vary from year to year. Sometimes the private sector may have a stronger number of positions, but just personally, I have younger friends in the bank who've graduated from the young professional role over the last couple of years. One of them is an environmental specialist who's came in to work with the Coral Triangle Initiative and now leads ADB's Oceans, the Blue Economy work. That's Deborah from New Zealand. That I have a Spanish friend. She is a civil engineer by background. She came into the bank from doing work with one of the Spanish NGOs following one of the big tropical cyclones in the Philippines. She's an engineer. She's gone on in her first 3 years to design one of the big urban investment, water and sanitation investments in the Pacific. So I think if you have this kind of mixed set of skills, maybe, you know, the masters that Nick is presenting, but I think it's also good to tick off various diplomas over the years, which you do remotely, but build up your skill set, and those courses, and how you market yourself. There's opportunities, obviously, in gender, in finance, and so many areas.
Are there any other comments that Samantha or Declan would like to make? We will aim to close in a few minutes, and if anybody has any other questions, please do post them in the live chat now. But otherwise, maybe Samantha or Declan might want to come in. And actually, while I'm sort of on, would you like to say something about maybe any focus that the ADB has on food security issues, for example, or nutrition?
Yeah, I can jump in. Well, just to reiterate what Noelle was saying, when the young professional program for this year or future years is advertised, they will be by TORs. So I think you will actually see on the job description what type of profile is people are looking for, and then you can therefore match whether your experience is relevant or not. So and I'd really encourage you to really just sell yourself, and it is a competitive process, but as much as you can make yourself stand out and do your research and homework, so when your application is very much tailored and shows that you demonstrate understanding of the organization and have done your work. On the food security piece, as I think the slide where I showed the operational areas, it fits with the rural development and food security is one of our operational priorities. So yes, we do place importance on it. And maybe I think you were just mentioning in terms of the network, for example, in the Philippines, we have quite a good cooperation with IRI, the International Rice Research Institute. So yeah, it fits into our development programming. And in some countries, it's more of a priority than others because that depends on our country partnership strategy. But definitely that we have people working in that area. Okay.
Are there any, I don't see any more questions coming in. Are there any more sort of closing comments that any of you might want to make before I wrap it up?
Just maybe, Nick, just to sort of say that I agree with what both Noelle and Samantha have said. Like, I think what's really unique about ADB is you've just got a very wide range of experience, and that's put to use across the organization. So I've got colleagues who are doctors, I've got colleagues who are teachers. You know, Noelle gave loads of examples of people with different backgrounds as well, and I think that's the point, is that you know ADB is looking to build up an organization with a diverse set of skills that's able to respond to the challenges that Asia and the Pacific is facing. And the great thing is that once you get in, it does also give you a chance to get involved in areas where maybe you're not a specialist, because there's always going to be need for different perspectives. If you're putting together an operation on air pollution, then you're going to need a range of perspectives to put something like that together well. You know, it's not just going to be people who are specialists on environment and specifically air pollution. But that would just be my final point.
Great, thanks, Declan. And I mean, I so much agree with that. And I think, you know, I suppose as somebody who's kind of at the, let's say, the later stages of my career in this area, I mean, it is just so fascinating. And I think what is really a challenge these days is to work in a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary way. And that's something that we try to put across in our programs as well, which is, you know, not always the way that universities tend to operate. That sometimes kind of train people in a very, you know, disciplinary specific and sectoral way, which is also fine. It's good to have, you know, specialisms, but I think when you actually get into the real world, if you like, you find you are working alongside people from all sorts of different disciplines, and that makes it so much more interesting in a way. So I can see one question's come in, which is very specific to me around the MSc program, and it's a very immediate question, I suppose, which is around whether we will have face-to-face teaching in the coming year because of the COVID situation. So what I would say is that we will, but we can't quite say the extent of it as yet, and we haven't got, you know, a full sort of direction from senior management as yet. I guess they're kind of waiting to see, will social distancing be reduced down to 1 meter, which we imagine it may well be. And if it is reduced down to 1 meter, then in terms of the master's program, we'd expect pretty much all of the delivery to be face-to-face. If it is stays at 2 meters, then it's going to be some kind of blend of face-to-face and online. But what I do know is that postgraduate talk programs are being prioritized along with first-year undergrad in terms of you know, the extent of classroom-based face-to-face teaching. So I think we can say that a good proportion of it, and hopefully all of it, will be face-to-face. So I think maybe that's where we're just up again at 12:30, and so I think if there's no more questions or comments, I'll just kind of close the webinar. It's been really interesting, really valuable information, which I hope those of you who are listening have found useful. I'm sure you have, and I think it's great to you know, to learn about such a big organization, and the fact that there are opportunities for Irish people to engage with ADB in the future. And I hope people will kind of look seriously at the ADB as an option. So I suppose just to really sincerely thank Samantha and Noelle and Declan for your contributions. Really informative, really interesting. Also like to thank Ord in the background for helping to set up the link with the ADB. And then I think on the UCC side, Michael Keneally and Alice Creed and Nicholas Sathers for the technical support and the kind of promoting the webinar in the first case. So I'm hoping that this will be just the start of a connection between UCC and ADB, and I'm also hoping that you know, some of the people who are on the call will, you know, seriously take an interest in what's on offer. And I think Samantha very generously put her email address out there. So apart from the fact that there's information on the website, I'm sure she seemed to indicate a willingness to respond to any queries. But so anyway, that's good. And from my side, you know, I also hope that we will have interest in the master's program, because you know, food security is a huge issue, a huge development challenge, which also you know, provides many kind of interesting career opportunities as well. So so I hope generally people have found this webinar useful. I've really enjoyed it, and I think with that we'll close and say goodbye, and stay safe to everybody.